Nora Loreto, and I am a freelance journalist.
Thank you, Nora. So I have a few different questions about Quebec Solidaire, but I was looking a little bit into your article you wrote about a year and a half ago for a passage just in regards to the decolonial, decolonial anti-racist collective, and I was hoping to ask you a little bit more about that. So I know it's kind of hard to briefly explain what happened, but I was wondering if you could just give a little explanation to the difficulties that happened between Quebec Solidaire and the Decolonial Anti-Racist Collective.
Yeah, there was a group of people who had been frustrated with a lot of things that had been happening in the party. I think that the frustration was probably most concentrated around the way that leadership would respond to issues or didn't respond to issues. On his feet, Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois is not super good in talking about issues of racism or colonization. When he does talk about it, it comes across as being like, it's just not something that he understands as well as he understands a lot of other issues. And because he has mastered so many issues, you can really hear that he's not in his comfort zone talking about some of the stuff. And so the Decolonial Caucus emerges to try and bring together the critics of the party inside the party to coordinate their criticism and to find a path or an avenue to try and make change within the party, to try and give people like a location to advocate for these issues, because it didn't really exist before at all, before it existed, before the caucus existed. And, they were radical, they're politically radical. And for a party that wants to reimagine a sovereign Quebec, making sure that colonization and decolonization is at the front of everybody's mind is really, really important. So I think that they were driven by that principle, by making sure that whenever we're imagining a sovereign Quebec, we're not simply imagining a mini Canada, right? Which is, I think, actually something that most sympathizers of Quebec Solidaire and a progressive vision of sovereignty do believe in. But the party didn't deal with this caucus very well. They were expelled. And I mean, the details, it's been a long time since I've gone back to this history or this story, but the details, it was silly the way that they did it. It was done publicly. It was done. There was like negative comments or comments that cast aspersions on this group made by Men en Masse, say publicly before a Congress. And it was just handled so poorly that, as someone who is outside of Montreal, as someone who is Anglophone and from not from Quebec, I'm just sitting there watching this going, oh my God, like there are so many better ways to deal with this. But then you start to look at statistics. One survey of the membership demonstrated that the membership of the party is like 96% white, which, the leadership is not that white. The leadership, I mean, as a percentage of the caucus, like before it was 2 of 10 members. So 20% of the caucus was not white. And then in other leadership positions as well, there are people who are not white. But the membership being that white obviously meant that issues that are important to racialized communities often didn't get through to the instances within the party that it needed to. And I think that, there was a lot of energy put into fighting to change the party's position away from Bouchard Taylor, like the position on religious symbols. And that hit such a moment that when it was finally all done, I think a lot of people were like, hoo, okay, that was really intense. And we have flipped this party's position. And I mean, it was like truly people's positions changed through a lot of debate and a lot of discussion. And it just felt like March 2019, everything just kind of stopped. And the party never figured out really how to effectively challenge the racism inherent in a lot of the bills and approaches of François Legault.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about, and you just mentioned it now too, but the low amount of members who are people of color. And I was also thinking about the way that the party, as you mentioned in your article, the way that the party mentions to, pardon me, responds to issues of racism, and how they're so well, especially online and, during speeches, using examples of, pardon me, responding to feminist issues, but that they're not so successful with doing the same towards issues of racism. How do you think maybe the
Yeah.
party could tackle this alongside, improving the amount of people of color that are members?
Well, I mean, let's go back. Like, what is so interesting is I think of a conversation that I was part of in Montreal many years ago, where we were talking about Anglophones in Quebec Solidaire, but the issue of race came up. And Amir Kadir was on the panel, and he was saying, like, this is a party where the spokespeople from the start have been not white and was founded, like rooted in anti-racist and decolonial struggles. A lot of those struggles being international struggles, right? Not necessarily struggles from inside Quebec, but people that have connections and relationships with international struggles of anti-colonialism. Especially South America. I mean, the role of Chilean activists in Quebec Solidaire is really, really major. I mean, the mark that Chilean left wing activists have had on this party has been tremendous. But Amir was saying, we made the mistake of thinking that founding a party with this racialized leadership and a diversity built throughout the instances at the time in 2006 was going to be enough to be an anti-racist party. And that's not how it works. It isn't, it's always a struggle. It's always fighting against tides of white supremacy because we exist in white supremacy. Like you can't live in Limoilou and not breathe in the nickel. Like it's in the air. So, the party never figured out how to, really, really, really struggle and make sure that anti-racism was at the core of its being. Now, let's look at that in comparison to the feminist movement. I mean, feminists within every instance of Quebec Solidaire are still every single issue. But what about women? But what about the feminist perspective? What about this? It's actually amazing. And, you give total credit to a lot of the folks who've been in the feminist struggle for many, many, many decades. Any issue in almost any instance in this province, you will have feminists say, okay, but how does this affect women? Okay, but what is the impact on feminism? And sometimes it feels like, whoa, like, do we still need to do this? We're still like, women are still like so subservient that we need to literally think of the feminist lens through every single one of our conversations. But that's the kind of militancy that puts someone like Manon Massé at the head of the party, right? Otherwise, that would be completely impossible. And that's the kind of militancy that you need to resist patriarchy. And so the feminist movement was one half of the founding of Quebec Solidaire. And then the other half was also full of feminists, right? So it wasn't like only one half. Like this is a major significant tendency within the party. And anti-racism has just never come close. I mean, the anti-racist movements don't look like the feminist movement, and they're more diverse in terms of the issues that people care about and how people organize. And I don't think that the people at the core of the party understand this. Seeing a lot of people respond to the decolonial caucus as saying, well, they're just troublemakers. They're just being factional or whatever. Said to me that they just really didn't understand this, because if we put that into terms of feminism, it would be like a standard political party and a radical feminist confrontation being like, you've forgotten about feminism. You forgot about women. You forgot about these issues, right? It's the exact same thing, except that feminism is so strong and defended and protected within the party. And that impact is seen everywhere. And if Nadeau Dubois said something that was like not feminist, like you could imagine he's getting an earful when he gets off the stage. That's not the case. And when he says the N-word on national television, I mean, I'm sure that he did get an earful over that inside the party, certainly did outside the party, but like he wouldn't have even been goaded into doing that. He would have been like, I'm sorry, are you kidding me right now? This is a child's game. Like, why would I play a child's game? Something like that, right? So, but it is interesting to think of the differences, and representation is definitely part of it, but much bigger is that organized, committed core of anti-racist activists just does not exist in the party. in the same way as feminists. Of course, there's anti-racist activists in the party. I don't want to like, pretend like there's nobody doing that work, but
Thank you. Is there, I guess, just given the way that Quebec Solidaire reacted to the decolonial anti-racist collective, is there a way that they could kind of backtrack on this and make amends and improve?
I mean, like, we also have to be clear that some of the people in the anti-racist and decolonial collective, like, these were also just like beefs that people had. Like, there's a long relationship with some of these people within the core of the party and outside the core of the party. And I think that a lot of the reaction, like, had it been different people, and I'm specifically thinking of the white people involved here, not the racialized people, but had it been different people, I think that the reaction would have been probably much different. Not because the party is better on anti-racism, but because in a lot of cases people saw individuals using this to try and get back at the party. That was the biggest message that I saw when I was fighting with my friends. They're like, well, you know who they are, Nora, like, you know what they're doing. And it's like, you have to separate like the people you don't like or the people who you perceive as being troublemakers because they're right, like they're correct. And if the execution isn't perfect, I mean, who cares? We have to pull good politics out of things that are happening all the time. So I think that like Quebec leader is not like at all long gone. Let's look at what happened 2 days ago. I mean, the caucus grew by two new members. They lost, of course, a member, probably because of her activism against a big corporation, right? Let's be clear that the loss in the North is likely related to Emily's activism against the Fonderie Horn. But they just elected two radical, racialized MNAs, and not just that, but someone like Haroun Bouazi, who's had a national platform challenging government positions, challenging Islamophobia. So, I mean, I think the party, it's like definitely not lost. There's a lot that can be done. But what for a progressive grassroots party, the problem is that you have to do that grassroots work. It isn't enough to say, well, we have Andreas, we have Alejandra, we have Haroun, right? That's not what's Ruba, of course. That's not what's going to make the party anti-racist. What makes the party anti-racist is grassroots organizing in every part of this province. And it's needed now more than ever when the CAQ is using these issues to get elected, especially outside of Montreal. It means that those of us outside of Montreal need to see anti-racism work as being absolutely critical to the success and survival of Quebec Solidaire. And in Quebec City, like, I don't think that's happening. I certainly don't see diversity within the teams that were working to get like my local candidate elected. Because it's a lot of segregation in the city. There's a lot of segregation, and people do not naturally work together for a whole bunch of systemic reasons. But Quebec Solidaire has to figure this out, and they can, of course, but the stakes are very, very high, and so they need to figure this out really quickly.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going in a lot to the decolonialism, but just in regards to thank you. In regards to sovereignty, I guess I want to both ask about, can we expect a party with issues in regards to upholding anti-racism to create a decolonial state, and also, if they do, what happens if in the next election cycle, Quebec Solidaire isn't the party that wins?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, like, when we're talking about sovereignty, it's not in the abstract, right? Like, sovereignty means breaking away from Canada. And Canada is also a white colonial state, a white supremacist colonial nation state. So then the question becomes, well, how do you create a new state that doesn't replicate the racism of the old state? And there's a lot of debate about this. I mean, there's a lot of left-wing people think that you can't do it, which is not something that I believe in, because then, like, what do you mean you can't do it? Then what do we do? Like, we just fix Canada? Like, no offense, but no one's fixing Canada, right? So then it's like the question is, how do you do it? And this is, I think, where Quebec Solidaire like has to be very, very careful because it can definitely set itself up for a new right wing nationalist Quebec sovereigntist, not nationalist in the way the CAQ is, a party to just then take it over and be like, well, now we're just gonna have a shitty new Quebec, right? But it wouldn't be QS's fault. I think that like when we're talking about building a new society, a lot of what the Parti Québécois was talking about in the 1970s absolutely applies today. And a lot of that's been erased because of the rise of the right wing of the sovereignty movement throughout the 80s and the 90s, right? Like, let's keep in mind that the sovereignty movement in the 1990s, it was a coalition between right and left. And when you accept a coalition between right and left, it's acknowledging the fact that we will have to have these struggles regardless of what nation we're in. It will always exist in Canada, and as a majority white nation, it will always exist in Quebec, including a sovereign Quebec. Now, can you say that a sovereign Quebec would solve white supremacy? No, probably not. But you can certainly look at the structures within Canadian society that perpetuate white supremacy and say, are there ways that we can rebuild something in Quebec that doesn't do that? And so let's think in this very concrete terms. Federalism is one system that maintains white supremacy. It allows provinces and the federal government to refuse to take responsibility. I'm going to pause right here because my battery is low. I will be right back. Aha, perfect. All right. Good?
All good.
Okay. Yeah, the federal structure in and of itself perpetuates white supremacy because you've got all of these levels of government refusing to take responsibility, things fall through the cracks, and then things like are just perpetually getting worse. So it's like, okay, so an independent Quebec can't have a federal system the way that the federal government has. That's an easy one to get rid of, actually, because Quebec wouldn't have that. And then you have to start talking about rewriting the Constitution and who's involved in that and what does the Citizens Assembly look like. And you can design a citizens assembly to be completely representative. You can design these structures to be completely representative. Then you'd have to make sure you're giving funds to marginalized communities to make sure that they have the resources to participate in the way that the massive corporations would be participating. And then, of course, the biggest question is then what's the relationship with Indigenous people and on that, I mean, that's really, really the biggest question, right? What does a land sharing agreement look like? All of this stuff is possible. All of this stuff is possible. There are more than enough philosophers and activists to think through some really difficult questions. But if we create an independent Quebec, could it fall to a bunch of racists? Of course, of course. Everything can. And so that just then goes back to the need for struggle. But I'm not swayed by, but that might happen as being an argument against doing these things because the status quo has already demonstrated that it's incapable of actually doing anything better. So, this is why you need to have such a powerful grassroots, national, like not just located in Montreal, anti-racist struggle within the party to be able to navigate these issues and to make sure that they are as natural as feminism is, right? Like again, an independent Quebec isn't going to be in and of itself feminist. You can create new structures to make it more feminist, but you're always struggling against the patriarchy.
Thank you. And then I wanted to ask what you think about some Anglophones who feel betrayed that Quebec Solidaire has not taken a stronger stance against Law 96 in terms of Anglophone rights.
I mean, okay, so as an Anglophone outside of Montreal, Bill 96 is not something I care about. I have to be honest. Like when I talk to Montrealers, they're like, this is the end of the world. It's like, No, I can't get a well, I have a family doctor, but getting a family doctor, that's the end of the world. That the environment is the end of the world. I think that I I mean, we are hegemonic in North America. Nothing is threatening English rights. Nothing is threatening English rights. Like you can go and get English services in a French majority province. And so I think that the problem with Bill 96 is that there are pieces in it that absolutely are that need to be undone. And I think we need to keep our eye on what those are, right? Like denying Indigenous languages is a huge problem. We need to make sure that the state is funding and supporting Indigenous language at the same amount that they support English. I think that that's very, or more actually. And then all of these exigences of like immigrants learning French as soon as possible, like that's all also needs to change. But all like but it's a French province. I mean, I know that there's historical Anglophones and all this kind of stuff, but it's so funny to me having just been in Montreal a couple of days ago. And I mean, I would never speak English to someone at a store. Never. Like just, I wouldn't do that because I live in Quebec. And then everyone's switching to speak to me in English. I'm like, oh, right. Montreal is not Quebec City. It's a different kind of place. So I think that it's a very local struggle with local concerns and local experiences, local manifestations of what that looks like. But when we're talking about restricting English language in the CEGEP system, let's say, I mean, the real issue is that the private CEGEPs will still be locations where Francophone wealthy students can go. That's the real issue. Like it's the class issue, or restricting allophones from going to English school when wealthy Francophones will be able to go, because you need to be able to speak English if you're going to do certain careers like being a doctor or a dentist or an engineer or something like that, right? That's the issue. Or let's talk about austerity and how under austerity, we will lose access to English or multiple language speaking doctors and nurses because they're shrinking the state, right? But this whole idea that like it's an attack on, I mean, I'm very cynical about it because it is so not part of my daily life here. I did not speak French when I moved here, and just like any person that doesn't speak the language of the society, you figure it out. And there's an Anglo chauvinism that I really dislike that's really wrapped up in the discussion of Bill 96. So yeah, I think QS should have voted against it, absolutely. But it's only those parts. I mean, the vast majority of the bill is not the doomsday stuff that I think a lot of people have made it out to be. But that might be very controversial. I mean, I don't know.
It's difficult to talk about Bill 96. And
Well, it's funny because like my friend who's a professor of dentistry at Laval, she's American. She's like, my colleagues at McGill like are literally thinking they're being sent to a gulag. Like, do you have anything I could send to them to calm them down? I'm like, no. Like, tell them to read the bill. Like, it's really long and boring, but tell them to read the bill if they're really concerned about it. You know, again, it's a completely different, and this is that kind of interesting cultural difference is a huge divide between Montreal and the rest of the province. I mean, I don't think that there's a city in Canada that has that much of a cultural divide with the rest of the part of the rest of the province. Not even Toronto. Not even Toronto has that kind of different cultural experience than the rest of the province. People are just like, oh, it's Toronto. You know, you can make fun of Torontonians, but like the difference between someone from Toronto and someone from London or Waterloo or Sudbury, I mean, there's differences, but it's not huge. But I mean, it's really different. Montreal, and this goes back to the problem of concentrating immigration to the island of Montreal. I mean, that's a disaster. That's a disaster for building a cohesive society. Immigration needs to be spread out. People need to be from all over the place. People need to have contact with immigrants. And the idea that 80% of immigrants go to Montreal, I mean, that's a complete disaster. And you can go to any small town in Canada and it is not as white as the small towns in Quebec. And we don't talk about that enough, like just how much of a disaster that kind of immigration planning really is.
100%. That's a very important point. I don't have any other questions, but I kind of wanted to give you a moment for anything I didn't ask, but specifically maybe any critiques you have on Quebec Solidaire and maybe any kind of highlights that you want to mention that you're seeing in this party that you're not seeing in other provincial parties in Quebec?
Yeah. I'll start with the positives and then maybe I'll come up with other critiques because I mean my main critiques I've pretty much already said. Um, the positives, and again, this I think is something that people forget. There is nothing that even comes close to Quebec Solidaire in any other part of this country. Like not even a little bit, including all of the problems they have with racism, all of the problems that we've talked about already, including the obsession with communications. I mean, there's a real virage there, like communication, that is a huge problem within the party that I think is something they need to undo, or else it's going to continue to be a problem. But that all included, there is nothing even kind of close in the rest of Canada. And that I don't say this to say, therefore we should be happy and therefore we need to support QS, but it's like we're starting actually at a place that is far more advanced than anywhere else in Canada. And the reason for that is because of sovereignty. And so you don't have to be a sovereigntist. I mean, I know lots of federalists that vote for QS, and I get it that this is not an issue that is as easy as as it is to other people. I mean, for me, it's very, very black and white and easy, and I know that it's not the case for other people. But the role that sovereignty has played in expanding the imagination of the left cannot be ignored. And so when you're talking to an activist or left-wing person in Regina, and there's no unblocking the problems that they have. Ottawa is distant, doesn't care about us. The government in Regina are hardcore right-wingers. They certainly do not care about us, and the NDP is chasing the center. There is no space for imagination, and there's no space for creativity, and there's no space for designing a new country. I mean, that's literally what we're doing here. And so you can be a federalist all you want, for sure. I respect that. But understand that the radicalness in a party like Quebec Solidaire is only possible because of sovereignty, because they're saying, forget the script, we're ripping it up, we're creating something new. And it is possible to create something that would be existing within the bounds of Canada that could be more radical. The NDPs all across Canada could be more radical for sure, but you always hit a barrier. And that barrier is federalism. You always hit that barrier. And every provincial NDP will always hit that barrier and say, we're going to make higher education free. And then it's like, but you don't have the power of taxation. How are you going to do that? And then they have to get really creative, and then it's really difficult, and then people don't believe them or whatever. And so we have something very, very, very special in this party. And it's also a political party. It's not a movement. Like, it's not like I saw so many people saying, well, this is gonna be the first time I don't vote for QS because of Bill 96. It's a political party. Like, this is, you don't have to agree with 100%. You shouldn't agree with 100% of any political party. Don't vote for QS if you don't want to vote for QS. But let's remember that politics is messy. It's dirty. There's no purity in it at all. And what we need to do as left-wing people is push and push and push to make sure that the balance is always having left-wing pressure, in the same way that we need to bring anti-racist pressure and feminist pressure on the party so that they stop any slide to the center. That's the real thing. So recognizing that it really is a jewel in this country in terms of what Canadian political culture has been able to produce. Of course, Quebec Solidaire is produced by Quebec political culture. And I think it's a really important vehicle for being able to talk about social change that just doesn't exist anywhere else. And it's also full of problems. It's full of contradictions. That's life under capitalism. And we need to be pushing the party. The party doesn't get a free pass because it's a great left-wing party. And so we need to keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing and pushing to make sure that it understands like what its role needs to be in defending left-wing values, defending left-wing social programs, challenging the right-wing nationalism of the CAQ.
Thank you so much. Was there anything else you wanted to add or important for me to consider?
No, I think that's probably good.
Perfect. Thank you again for your time. It was such a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime.